What if everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages was wrong? Forget the Hollywood cliches of filthy peasants' witches burning at the stake and knights in shining armor. The reality was stranger, darker, and far more disturbing than any movie could capture. In the next few minutes, you'll discover practices so bizarre that if done today would land you in prison or worse. This is the side of history no classroom ever told you. So, hit that subscribe button now, because once you hear these stories, you'll never see the medieval world the same way again. Between the fall of Rome in 476 and the dawn of the Renaissance in 1453, Europe lived through nearly 1,000 years of experimentation, superstition, and desperation. Life was brutal, death was constant, and survival demanded strange solutions. Some of these practices were rooted in blind faith, others in flawed science, and a few were simply madness dressed up as tradition. Together, they reveal a civilization balancing on the razor's edge between order and chaos. Take medicine, for example. Imagine walking into a medieval hospital with nothing worse than a headache, only to leave carried out on a stretcher. For over 7 centuries, European doctors relied on one universal cure: draining your blood. To them, bloodletting wasn't dangerous, it was science. They believed sickness came from having too much blood, and the solution was obvious: cut you open and let it flow out. This wasn't some back alley superstition. The practice was taught in Europe's most prestigious universities, like the famed medical school of Salerno in Italy. Doctors proudly wielded sharp lancets, attaching leeches to their patients, or using heated glass cups to suck blood from the skin. In their eyes, this was cutting-edge medicine. In reality, it was mass malpractice. Picture it: a patient lying on a wooden cot, staring in horror as their life force dripped into a bowl, while a physician stroked his beard and nodded with satisfaction. The patient might feel slightly better for a moment because lowering blood pressure can bring temporary relief. But soon after, the body collapsed, often fatally. The false sense of improvement kept this nightmare alive for centuries. Kings and peasants alike suffered under this cure. In 1685, King Charles II of England suffered a stroke. His doctors drained nearly 2 pints of blood from his body, believing it would save him. Instead, it hastened his death. Even George Washington, centuries later, was bled so severely for a throat infection that he lost almost 40% of his blood within a day. Shock and blood loss killed him faster than the illness itself. The cruel irony is that the more the practice failed, the more determined doctors became to try again. When a patient didn't recover, they claimed not enough blood had been taken. So they bled them again and again. Across Europe, countless lives ended not because of disease, but because of the very men trusted to heal. It took until the 19th century for medicine to finally abandon bloodletting as its universal cure. By then, the damage was already done. Millions had died unnecessarily, their lives claimed not by infection, but by science gone horribly wrong. To the medieval mind, however, this wasn't cruelty, it was hope, and that makes it all the more chilling. But bloodletting was only the beginning. The Middle Ages were filled with practices just as bizarre, each one revealing how people struggled to make sense of a world they didn't understand. Some were terrifying forms of justice. Others were religious scams disguised as salvation. And a few were so strange they sound more like dark fairy tales than real history. And if you think witch hunts were the ultimate symbol of medieval ignorance, here's a shocking truth: they barely happened during the Middle Ages at all. The stereotype of villagers burning women at the stake was largely a myth. The real witch-hunting frenzy didn't come until centuries later during the so-called Age of Enlightenment. And the twist: it wasn't Catholic peasants who did the most burning, it was Protestant reformers who claimed to know better. In fact, the Catholic Church of the early Middle Ages often dismissed witchcraft accusations as pagan nonsense. In 785, the Council of Paderborn outright banned punishing women for supposedly flying with the devil, declaring it superstition. Far from torch-wielding mobs, most medieval courts viewed witchcraft charges as laughable and even dangerous to those making them. The real explosion of witch hunts came much later, between 1550 and 1650, long after the medieval period had ended. Protestant regions of Germany and Scotland went absolutely mad, executing tens of thousands. In places like Würzburg and Bamberg, bishops desperate to prove their piety ordered mass burnings that claimed hundreds of lives in just a few years. Scotland followed suit, executing around 4,000 accused witches over the course of 2 centuries. Even King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, wrote an entire book about hunting witches, feeding the hysteria. The cruel irony is that the very era celebrated as the Renaissance, an age of supposed reason, produced far more witch burning than the Dark Ages ever did. So, next time you imagine medieval peasants gathering to watch women burn, remember this: the Middle Ages were not the age of witches. That grim honor belongs to the centuries that followed, when enlightened Europe lost its mind in a frenzy of fire and fear. And if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear how medieval courts actually decided guilt and innocence. Welcome to Trial by Ordeal, where divine judgment and human cruelty merged into a twisted system of justice. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, if evidence was unclear, courts simply tortured the accused and waited for God to intervene. Innocent, a miracle would save you. Guilty. Your suffering was proof enough. It was legal logic dipped in madness. One ordeal forced suspects to carry a red-hot iron bar across a set distance. Their hands were then bandaged and inspected 3 days later. If the burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they festered, you were guilty and likely doomed. Imagine placing your life in the hands of an open wound and a priest's interpretation. Another favorite was the ordeal of water. The accused were bound and thrown into a river. If they sank, they were declared innocent, but also drowned. If they floated, the water had rejected them as guilty, and they were pulled out only to face execution. It was a deadly catch-22 that no one could escape. Some opted for the ordeal of boiling water, plunging their bare arms into scalding liquid to retrieve a stone from the bottom. The depth depended on the crime: wrist deep for petty theft, elbow deep for serious offenses. Healing meant innocence. Infection meant guilt. The punishment was written directly on your skin. In some cases, accused individuals chose trial by combat instead. Here, accuser and accused, or sometimes their champions, fought to the death with the belief that God would grant victory to the righteous. Imagine watching your fate decided not by evidence, but by who swung the sword faster, the most chilling truth. These ordeals worked exactly as intended, but not because of divine intervention. Terrified of fire, boiling water, or drowning, many accused people confessed to crimes they hadn't committed just to avoid the ordeal. In this way, torture became medieval plea bargaining: confess now, or suffer the wrath of both man and God. By 1215, even the Church had had enough. At the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III banned clergy from overseeing ordeals, and without priests to bless the miracle, the whole system collapsed. Courts slowly shifted toward juries, and evidence a small step away from fear toward fact. But superstition didn't vanish. It simply found new targets, some of them on 4 legs. Yes, medieval courts tried animals like people. Across France, Italy, Switzerland, and the Holy Roman Empire, pigs, cows, even insects faced prosecution. The logic sounds unbelievable today. If God gave creatures a will, then creatures could commit crimes. And if they could commit crimes, they could be judged. What followed was theater dressed up as justice. In 1386, a pig in Falaise killed an infant. The town didn't just slaughter it, they staged a full criminal trial. The pig had a defense lawyer, a judge, and a sentence. For the execution officials dressed it in human clothes, jacket breeches, even white gloves, as if a costume could make the punishment feel righteous. The crowd watched a beast die like a man and called it order. Rodents and insects met the bench, too. One French court appointed a lawyer to defend field mice accused of destroying crops. Swiss judges summoned beetle larvae to appear, and when the insects naturally failed to show, they were tried in absentia and banished officially from the parish. The legal paperwork was meticulous. The reality was farce. Yet people believed because belief made chaos feel controlled. The same mix of certainty and error shaped medieval childcare. Parents loved their children as fiercely as we do, but bad advice turned that love into risk. Infants were fed honey and wine mixtures or cow's milk fortified with herbs. Wealthy families hired wet nurses, chosen not just for health but for virtue and even hair color convinced morals could pass through milk. Doctors inspected milk on fingernails to judge thickness and temperament. Swaddling bound babies into rigid stillness for months meant it to straighten limbs, but often harming breathing and circulation. Bathing was rare for infants. Some families wiped them with salt or wine instead. Each choice felt protective. The results were anything but. Teething brought coral necklaces, animal fat on gums, and fatally soothing syrups laced with narcotics. Pilgrimages pressed holy relics to tiny chests, spreading infections the parents could not see. With mortality so high, many families delayed naming a child until year 1, hoping not to carve a tombstone into memory. It wasn't cruelty, it was trust in a broken map. And about that filthy medieval myth, early and high medieval Europe actually liked to bathe. Cities ran public bathhouses with hot pools, steam rooms, and attendants. Monasteries mandated washing. Soap guilds existed. The wealthy perfumed the poor, scrubbed with ash and fat. Then the Black Death struck, and clean water started to look like a door the plague could walk through. Authorities warned that hot water opened pores to bad air. Communal baths closed. People pivoted to dry cleaning, changing linen obsessively, rubbing with scented cloths, masking odor instead of removing it. A crisp white shirt became health status and deodorant in one. The culture shifted, and later centuries blamed the Middle Ages for grime they themselves perfected. Perfumes bloomed wigs hid unwashed hair, and pomanders, little cages of herbs and spice, swung from belts like portable weather systems against stench and doom. Archaeology still reveals drains, latrines, and wash zones from the era we call dirty. Hygiene didn't disappear. It adapted under fear. And fear did more than change baths, it turned death itself into a spectacle the whole town would attend. Public executions in medieval Europe weren't hushed ceremonies. They were community carnivals full of shouting vendors and entire families treating death like theater. Markets closed, schools paused, and crowds of thousands gathered for what passed as the ultimate reality show, watching another human's final breath. Different crimes demanded different methods. Thieves swung from ropes, nobles lost their heads, heretics burned, and rebels faced the most inventive agonies. Each punishment was chosen not just for justice but for spectacle. The execution itself was the message carved into memory through terror and applause. Take William Wallace, the Scottish rebel. In 1305, he was hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled, while conscious his organs burned before his eyes, then finally beheaded and quartered. Every stage was cheered like acts of a grisly play. The audience wasn't horrified, they were entertained. Vendors sold ale bread, even roasted meat at the gallows. Pickpockets worked the crowds. The best seats balconies overlooking the scaffold were sold like premium tickets. Children were brought as moral lessons, told that the horror before them would keep their souls pure. Death wasn't hidden, it was marketed. Executioners became celebrities praised if they ended lives cleanly in a single stroke, booed if they botched the job. Some auctioned off the clothes of the condemned or sold pieces of rope as good luck charms. The line between justice and commerce blurred until death itself was a business. Burnings at the stake drew the biggest crowds. Heretics like Joan of Arc became symbols of divine punishment or divine injustice, depending on who you asked. Flames consumed not only bodies but reputations, cementing the idea that God's wrath could be witnessed like fireworks. And the people came to watch again and again. The church found another way to monetize fear this time, not with fire, but with forgiveness. Enter indulgences, pieces of parchment that promised reduced time in purgatory for the right price. With coin in hand, sin itself became negotiable, and eternity had a market rate. For ordinary believers, indulgences seemed like lifelines. Pay a day's wages for minor sins or months of income for the full wipe, total spiritual clearance. Some bought indulgences for their dead relatives, convinced coins could spring souls from suffering. Others even prepaid for sins they hadn't committed yet. Salvation on credit. The salesmen were professionals armed with slogans. One German friar, Johann Tetzel, made his pitch unforgettable: as soon as the coin in the coffer rings the soul from purgatory springs. Crowds poured money into the system, believing heaven itself was for sale. Behind the pious words, the cash built basilicas and lined papal treasuries. But indulgences carried an obvious poison: the rich could buy their way to heaven, while the poor, guilty of the same sins, remained damned. Nobles treated indulgences like licenses to misbehave, while ordinary priests watched their authority crumble. Outrage brewed, and soon a monk named Martin Luther would hammer his protest into history. The medieval imagination didn't just tremble at human corruption, it looked up in fear. The sky itself was a source of terror, with comets, eclipses, and strange lights interpreted as divine telegrams. To live under the stars was to live under constant warning, every flicker above carrying a threat below. In 1133, a solar eclipse plunged England into panic. Chroniclers linked it directly to the death of King Henry III, just 2 years later convinced the darkness had been a celestial obituary. Nobles quarreled over succession, while whispers claimed the heavens had already chosen sides. War soon followed, and the eclipse became prophecy fulfilled. Halley's comet blazed across Europe in 1066, just before the Norman conquest of England. The Saxons saw doom in its tail, the Normans saw destiny. On the Bayeux Tapestry, you can still see Englishmen pointing in dread, while Norman soldiers prepare for battle. The same light in the sky was read as despair by one army and triumph by another. By the 15th century, fear reached absurd levels. When a comet shone brilliantly in 1456, Pope Calixtus III formally excommunicated it as a servant of the devil. Bells rang across Europe, prayers were composed to fend off the celestial enemy. A rock of ice and dust was treated like a general of hell. Lunar eclipses brought their own chaos. Though scholars knew shadows caused them, peasants believed dragons or demons were devouring the moon. Entire villages banged pots and rang bells, trying to scare away invisible monsters. The night sky was a battlefield of faith and fear, and every family joined the fight with noise. Auroras too struck terror when they stretched southward. In 1204, the northern lights glowed so brightly across Europe that chroniclers described them as angelic armies locked in combat. For those watching from fields and towns, the heavens weren't beautiful, they were burning. The apocalypse seemed to flicker just overhead. Astrologers turned panic into profession. Royal courts employed them to predict battles, coronations, even marriages. Learned men calculated planetary conjunctions and warned kings of cosmic emergencies. Science and superstition danced together. accurate astronomy shackled to fearful prophecy. Yet the irony remains, universities could predict eclipses with precision, while still believing each one carried divine judgment. The same scholars who charted the heavens treated them as omens. Knowledge and fear lived side by side, neither strong enough to banish the other. And sometimes fear itself became law. That law took the form of trial by combat. From the 8th to the 14th century, courts across Europe allowed accuser and accused to fight to the death. The theory was simple: God would not allow the guilty to win. Justice was measured in muscle steel and survival. The most famous case unfolded in France in 1386. Knight Jean de Carouge accused Jacques Legris of violating his wife Marguerite. With no clear evidence, King Charles X authorized a judicial duel. Thousands gathered knowing that Marguerite's fate rested on her husband's blade. If Jean lost, she would burn alive for false testimony. On the day of the duel, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds packed into the Abbey of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, murmuring prayers and wagers in equal measure. Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris rode in on horseback, their armor gleaming in the winter sun, while Marguerite sat in silent terror, knowing her own life was tied to her husband's strength. The duel began with lances, each man charging like thunder across the field. The clash rang out steel, shattering horses screaming. Both men were thrown, yet neither yielded. They rose to continue on foot, swords and daggers, flashing every strike carrying the weight of divine judgment. The crowd roared with each blow, desperate for blood and truth. At last, Jean gained the upper hand. He drove his blade into Legris, who collapsed, gasping his final denial. Jean shouted his innocence while Marguerite wept with relief. To the crowd, it was not just victory, it was God himself speaking through the edge of a sword. Justice in their eyes had been revealed, but the system had cracks too large to ignore. Strong men, skilled fighters, or wealthy nobles with hired champions could tilt divine justice in their favor. Innocent men, too weak to fight, stood little chance. Over time, even church leaders grew uneasy. How often could God truly be siding with the strongest arm? By the 15th century, trial by combat was fading, replaced by more rational courts and evidence-based trials. Yet for centuries, Europe had believed that truth itself could be beaten out in the ring. And while the duels ended, the memory lingered, proof that faith and violence once walked hand in hand. Looking back across these 10 practices, it's easy to call the Middle Ages barbaric. But that judgment misses something essential. These people weren't fools or monsters. They were humans, working with the knowledge they had, trying to survive in a world filled with death, disease, and uncertainty. Their mistakes were vast, but their intentions were often earnest. Medieval parents loved their children. Medieval priests believed they were saving souls. Medieval doctors thought they were curing the sick. The tragedy lies not in malice, but in misdirection, a civilization following a map that pointed straight into darkness. And that makes their story eerily familiar, because if there is one lesson the Middle Ages scream at us, it is this: every age thinks its truths are eternal, until the future exposes them as madness. To us, bloodletting and animal trials are nightmares, but to them, our habits might have seemed just as deranged. Perspective turns sense into insanity and back again. Centuries from now, what will people say about us? Will they shake their heads at how we treated the planet, at how we trusted in flawed systems, at how we clung to practices that seemed normal, but were quietly lethal? The mirror of history doesn't flatter, it warns. And the warning is clear. The Middle Ages were not just an age of knights and castles, but an age of experiments that cost lives. Their bizarre customs reveal not only the strangeness of the past, but the fragility of human certainty. And if their world could believe such madness was wisdom, perhaps ours can too. So the question is, what will the future put on trial when it looks back at us? Every civilization writes its own rules of sanity. For the Middle Ages, it was ordeals by fire and blood trials for pigs and beetles and indulgences sold like tickets to heaven. They followed these rules not because they were cruel, but because they believed they were right. That belief is what makes their story so terrifying, because belief is timeless. We look back now and laugh at the absurdity of animal trials or at parents rubbing wine on their infants. But the laughter catches in our throats when we realize those parents loved their children no less than we love ours. They were not heartless, they were desperate. And desperation is a mirror we can all recognize. Imagine the crowds cheering at a public execution, children on shoulders, eating roasted meat while a man screams his last. To them, it was moral education. To us, it's horror. Yet, isn't it possible that some of our own entertainments would look just as grotesque to eyes centuries from now? The line is thinner than we admit. History doesn't whisper, it shouts. It tells us that certainty is fragile, that what feels eternal is temporary, and that human beings are endlessly capable of convincing themselves that cruelty is compassion. The medieval world believed it was righteous. So do we. The parallel is the most frightening part of all. Consider the indulgence sellers ringing their bells in the market square, promising heaven for coin. Ordinary people reached into their purses with trembling hands, buying hope they could never verify. Replace parchment with paperwork, and doesn't that sound familiar? We still pay for promises, only the currency has changed. The Middle Ages remind us that ignorance is not always malicious. It is often systemic, woven into the very structures that guide our lives. Doctors, priests, judges, kings, they weren't trying to kill, deceive, or torture. They were trying to maintain order in a world they didn't understand. The tragedy is how much suffering their order created. But here's the most chilling thought. What if the future looks back at us the same way? What if our medical treatments, our justice systems, our daily habits seem monstrous to descendants who know better? What if the things we believe are saving us are in fact quietly destroying us? When you peel back the veil of history, the Middle Ages are no longer a distant alien world. They are a reflection. 1,000 years of mistakes, yes, but also 1,000 years of lessons about faith, fear, and the cost of being human. Their story is not just about them, it is about us. So the next time you picture a knight on horseback or a peasant in a muddy street, remember the deeper truth: medieval Europe wasn't just strange, it was us in another costume. Their horrors are our inheritance, and their illusions are warnings etched into the bones of time. And now the question is yours to answer: which of our practices will horrify future generations, the way bloodletting and witch hunts horrify us? Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that pull the mask off history. Because if the Middle Ages teach us anything, it's this: what we call normal today might be the nightmare of tomorrow.